The year is 1978. The location is the deep, crushing darkness of the North Atlantic, specifically the region known to naval strategists as the Bermuda Box. This is a massive expanse of ocean off the eastern coast of the United States, a patrol zone where the fate of the world hangs in a delicate, silent balance. Down here, 400 meters beneath the surface, the pressure is enough to snap a human spine like a dry twig. But for the crew of the Soviet strategic missile submarine, a Project 667 Navaga, known to the West as the Yankee class, this pressure is home. Captain First Rank Valery Zhuravlev stands in the command center. The air is thick, recycled, smelling faintly of ozone, diesel oil, and the sweat of 120 men living in a steel tube. The lighting is dim, casting long shadows over the dials and gauges that are the eyes and ears of his vessel. Zhuravlev is a veteran. He knows his boat. He knows that the Navaga is a masterpiece of Soviet engineering, a vessel capable of carrying 16 R-27 Zib ballistic missiles, each one tipping the scales of global power. His orders are simple yet terrifying. Remain invisible, patrol the American coast, and wait for the order that he hopes will never come. To Captain Zhuravlev, his submarine is a predator. He believes he is a ghost in the water, sliding through the thermal layers of the Atlantic, undetectable. He believes the Americans are up there, on the surface, scanning with their radar and their satellites, looking for a wake that isn't there. He is confident. But then, the impossible happens. It does not begin with an explosion. It does not begin with a siren. It begins with a hesitation in the rhythm of the ocean. The sonar operator, a young warrant officer named Petrov, lifts his headphones, his face pale in the green wash of the scope. He looks at the captain. He does not speak immediately. In the silent service, you do not speak until you are certain, because uncertainty breeds panic. "Comrade Captain," Petrov whispers, pressing the headphones back to his ears, as if trying to physically push the sound into his brain. "I have a transient, astern, in the baffles." Zhuravlev moves to the station. "Identify." "Gone," Petrov says, his voice trembling slightly. "It was a mechanical transient, a metal click, like a hatch closing, but faint, ghostly." Zhuravlev frowns. The baffles, the blind spot directly behind the submarine where the churn of their own twin propellers and the roar of the turbulent water creates a cone of deafness. Nothing can see through the baffles. Nothing should be in the baffles. To be in the baffles of a moving submarine, an object would have to be matching their speed perfectly, maneuvering with impossible precision in the blind, churning wake of a two-propeller drive. "Biological?" Zhuravlev asks. The ocean is full of noises, whales, snapping shrimp, thermal layers shifting. "No, Captain, it was rhythmic. Then it vanished." Zhuravlev orders a standard check. They are running quiet, or so they think. The Yankee class is powerful, but it is not silent. It hums with the brute force of its reactors. The captain dismisses it. It must be a biological anomaly or a reflection from the seabed, a thermal layer bouncing their own noise back at them. Hours pass. The submarine continues its patrol pattern, but the mood in the command center has shifted. The air feels heavier. Then it happens again. This time, it is not a sound. It is a sensation. The boat shifts slightly, caught in a current that shouldn't be there. The hydrodynamics of the water around them feel wrong. Petrov at the sonar station stiffens. "Contact!" he hisses. "Transient signal, very close, astern. It sounded like a flow noise. Something displaced the water." Zhuravlev feels a cold prickle on the back of his neck. He looks at the depth gauge. They are deep. There are no surface ships here. There are no fishing trawlers. If there is something displacing water directly behind them, it has to be submerged. "Perform a check turn," Zhuravlev orders. This is a standard maneuver. The submarine turns roughly to the side to clear the blind spot, allowing the sonar to sweep the area that was previously hidden by the engine noise. The hull groans as the rudder bites into the black water. The submarine banks. The sonar array sweeps the dark ocean behind them. Silence. The green line on the screen revolves endlessly, painting nothing but the empty, cold void of the Atlantic. No contacts, no metal signatures, no engine hum. "Clear, Captain," Petrov reports, but he sounds unconvinced. "The ocean is empty." Zhuravlev exhales. Of course it is empty. It had to be a glitch, a phantom echo. He orders the boat back to its original course. They return to the patrol, but the mystery does not leave them. Over the next 48 hours, the impossible events compound. It becomes a psychological torture. At one point, the passive sonar picks up a strange hole in the ocean background noise. It is as if a massive object is moving through the water, blocking the ambient sounds of the sea, yet emitting no noise of its own. A black hole in the soundscape. How can a machine of war, made of steel and valves and pumps, move without sound? It defies the laws of physics as the Soviets understand them. The crew begins to whisper. They talk of American secret weapons. They talk of sea monsters. They talk of their own equipment failing. The political officer tries to maintain discipline, lecturing them on the superiority of Soviet technology. But even he looks at the bulkheads with suspicion. Zhuravlev stands by the periscope well, though they are far too deep to use it. He runs the scenario through his mind. If there was a vessel there, he would hear it. American submarines are nuclear. They have pumps. They have coolant loops. They have reduction gears. They make noise. To be that close, to be right on top of them, the noise should be deafening. If they are there, and they are silent, then everything Zhuravlev knows about naval warfare is a lie. Then comes the incident that nearly breaks them. It is day 3 of the ghost phenomenon. The sea is rough far above, but calm down here. Suddenly, the sonar shack erupts. High-frequency ping, single burst, close range. Zhuravlev spins around. An active sonar ping is an act of aggression. It is a shout in a dark room. Someone is painting them. Range and bearing? Directly below us, Captain. Range 0. The command center freezes. 0 range. That is impossible. That would mean the source is touching the hull. "It's gone," Petrov whispers, terrified. "Just one ping, like they were checking the distance." Zhuravlev grips the railing. His heart is hammering against his ribs. This is not a glitch. This is intelligence. Something is out there. Something is toying with them. It is watching them, measuring them, perhaps even touching them, and yet it refuses to be seen. The fear is not just about being found. It is about the total inability to understand what found them. Before we dive deeper into this underwater nightmare and the technological revelation that changed the Cold War, if you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please verify your subscription to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. The stakes for Captain Zhuravlev could not be higher. You must understand what his submarine represents. This is not just a ship. It is a component of the Soviet Union's nuclear triad. The entire strategy of mutually assured destruction relies on the fact that these submarines cannot be found. If the Americans can find a Yankee-class submarine in the open ocean, track it, and remain invisible while doing so, then the Soviet nuclear deterrent is effectively worthless. If the Americans can kill the boomers before they launch, the balance of power collapses. Zhuravlev knows this. He knows that if he reports a ghost, he will be laughed at by the Admiralty. They will say he is hallucinating. They will say he is unfit for command. But if he ignores it, and there really is a threat, he endangers the motherland. He is trapped in a paradox. He is the captain of the most powerful weapon system on Earth, yet he feels like a blind man walking through a room full of razors. He orders another turn, more aggressive this time, a crazy Ivan. A sharp, sudden turn designed to catch a shadower off guard, forcing them to turn hard to avoid a collision, thereby revealing their position with a burst of cavitation noise. The Yankee class lurches, plates groan, the crew grabs onto stanchions. The submarine swings 180 degrees, its sonar clearing the baffles violently. They listen. They wait for the screech of a propeller, the panic of a sudden turn, the sound of an American sub trying to brake. Nothing, just the hiss of the water. "Nothing, Captain," Petrov says, defeated. "We are chasing shadows." Zhuravlev stares at the sonar screen. He wants to believe it. He wants to believe the ocean is empty. But deep down, a cold dread is settling in his gut. He realizes that the silence is not proof of safety. The silence is the threat. Because if there is a machine out there that can dance with a turning submarine, match its erratic movements, and remain quieter than the background noise of the Atlantic Ocean, then the Soviet Union has already lost the war at sea. They just don't know it yet. The captain does not know that a few hundred yards away, separated by a wall of water and a chasm of technology, a tape recorder is spinning, capturing every groan, every pump cycle, and every word spoken aboard his ship. He does not know that he is not the hunter. He is the prey, and the hunt has been going on for days. Captain Zhuravlev returns to port in the grey, freezing waters of the Kola Peninsula. The submarine base at Gadjievo is a bleak landscape of concrete, rusting cranes, and snow. The mood on the dock is somber. The mission was technically a success. They patrolled. They remained unengaged. They returned. But the psychological toll on the command crew is visible. They look like men who have seen a ghost. The investigation begins not with a scientific inquiry, but with an interrogation. In a windowless room smelling of stale tobacco smoke and wet wool, Zhuravlev faces a panel of senior officers from the Northern Fleet and a representative from the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. The Soviet system does not reward unexplained phenomena. Unexplained phenomena are treated as errors, and errors are treated as crimes. "Repeat your statement, Captain," the Admiral says, tapping a thick file on the metal table. "You claim you were tracked for 3 days by a vessel that showed no sonar return, made no engine noise, and could maneuver in your baffles while you performed evasive turns." "Yes, Comrade Admiral," Zhuravlev says, keeping his voice steady. "And yet," the Admiral continues, leaning forward, "your acoustic tapes show nothing, just the ocean, just the background noise of the Atlantic. Are we to believe in phantoms? Or are we to believe that your sonar operators were hallucinating from fatigue?" This is the Soviet dilemma. The evidence of the American presence is negative evidence. It is the absence of normal readings that terrified the captain, but bureaucracy demands positive proof. The tapes are played again. The room fills with the hiss of static. The experts point to the spikes on the graph. "Here," the acoustic analyst says, pointing to a jagged line, "biological, likely a pod of whales. And here, thermal layer distortion." The captain interpreted natural oceanography as a hostile contact. The verdict is humiliating, but predictable. Pilot error. Paranoia. The crew is reprimanded for filing false reports. Zhuravlev is not stripped of command, but a black mark is placed next to his name. He is sent back out to sea. But Zhuravlev is not the only one. As the months of 1978 turn into 1979, a pattern begins to emerge that the Admiralty can no longer ignore. Reports start filtering in from other Yankee and Delta-class boat commanders. They are fragmented, whispered in officers' messes, and filed in classified folders that are slowly stacking up in Moscow. One commander reports a collision alarm screaming in deep water, only for the sensors to show empty ocean seconds later. Another reports hearing machinery noises, clearly through the hull while sitting stationary on the seabed. Noises that sounded like a reactor pump, but far too quiet to be one of theirs. A legend begins to build within the Soviet Navy. They call it the Shadow. The Soviet response is a massive, frantic, but fundamentally flawed investigation. They form a special technical commission to identify the source of these anomalies. But because they cannot conceive that the Americans have achieved total acoustic invisibility, they look for other answers. They look for the enemy everywhere except where the enemy actually is, in the technology gap. First, they blame the equipment. The Soviet naval doctrine relies heavily on the brute force of their sonar arrays. They believe their sensors are powerful, perhaps too powerful, picking up ghosts in the data processing. Teams of engineers descend on the submarines in dry dock. They tear apart the sonar consoles, rewiring them, replacing valves with solid-state transistors, trying to filter out the hallucinations. They tighten the sensitivity thresholds. Ironically, by reducing the sensitivity to eliminate ghosts, they make their submarines even blinder. They are effectively putting on darker sunglasses to stop seeing flashes of light. Next, they blame sabotage. The paranoia of the Cold War takes a dark turn. The KGB becomes involved. If the Americans are tracking them, they reason, it cannot be because American subs are invisible. It must be because the Soviet subs are carrying a beacon. A period of intense, invasive physical searches begins. This is the era of the hull sweeps. Before a strategic missile submarine leaves port, frogmen are sent into the freezing water to scour every inch of the hull. They are looking for magnetic trackers, limpet mines, or transponders attached by American spies or saboteurs. Inside the boat, counterintelligence officers rip up floor plates and dismantle radios, searching for a transmitter that might be broadcasting their position to a satellite. They find nothing. The investigation then turns to the realm of the exotic. Soviet scientists, desperate to provide an answer that doesn't involve American superiority, propose wild theories. One leading theory is that the Americans have developed a network of seabed sensors so advanced that they can track the displacement of water itself. They theorize that the Americans aren't tracking the sound of the sub, but the pressure wave it pushes through the ocean. If this were true, no amount of silencing would help. Another theory suggests the Americans are using a new type of radar satellite that can penetrate the ocean's surface, seeing the submarine's wake from space. This leads to the Soviets experimenting with strange paint schemes and wake suppression tactics, wasting millions of rubles on solving a problem that doesn't exist. The tragedy of the Soviet investigation is that they are asking the right question: how are they finding us? But they are refusing to accept the answer. The answer is that the ocean is a sound channel, and the Soviet submarines are simply too loud. To the Soviet Admiralty, a submarine is a machine of power. It has 2 nuclear reactors. It has 2 massive propellers. It is a beast. To make it silent seems counterintuitive to the philosophy of Soviet heavy industry. They believe that noise is a byproduct of power. They assume the Americans are subject to the same laws of physics. If a Soviet sub hums, an American sub must hum. They do not understand the concept of rafting, the American technique of isolating the entire engine room on rubber mounts so that no metal touches the hull. To a Soviet engineer in 1979, placing a nuclear reactor on rubber shock absorbers sounds like madness, a structural weakness waiting to collapse. So, they double down on their existing doctrine. The investigation concludes that the shadow is a combination of natural phenomena and aggressive American surface tactics. They decide that since they cannot hide, they must run. New orders are issued to the fleet. If you suspect a contact, do not go quiet. Go fast. Go deep. The Soviet strategy shifts to speed and depth. They begin pushing the designs for the next generation of submarines, titans like the Typhoon and speed demons like the Alpha class, believing that they can outrun the ghosts. They instruct their captains to use active sonar more frequently, to blast the water to clear it. This is a catastrophic error. By going faster, they make more noise. By using active sonar, they act like a burglar turning on a flashlight in a dark house, instantly revealing their position to everyone in the neighborhood. While the Soviet committees argue in Moscow, analyzing charts and blaming sunspots, the crews on the front lines are left in a state of high anxiety. The sailors know the truth. They know the ghosts are real machines. In the mess hall of a Delta III submarine, a sonarman whispers to his friend, "It's not a satellite," he says, staring into his tea. "I heard it breathe. When we stopped, it stopped. When we moved, it moved. It's a hunter, and it's laughing at us." The investigation has failed. The Soviets have convinced themselves that the threat is external. Satellites, spies, sabotage. They have failed to look in the mirror. They have failed to realize that their silent service is screaming into the void. And while they spend billions chasing wake detection satellites and magnetic mines, a small group of engineers in the United States Navy is preparing to launch the very thing the Soviets believe is impossible. The Soviets are looking for a new weapon. They are about to be hit by a new philosophy. The stage is set. The Soviets are confused, paranoid, and looking in the wrong direction. The ocean is about to get much more crowded, and the predator is about to reveal its teeth. But it won't be a monster. It will be a machine so precisely engineered that it effectively removes itself from the universe of sound. While the Kremlin was paralyzed by paranoia, conducting witch hunts for saboteurs and theorizing about space lasers, the answer to the mystery was sitting quietly in a dry dock 4,000 miles away. The location is Groton, Connecticut, the General Dynamics electric boat shipyards. The year is 1976. If the Soviet submarine program was a forge of brute industrial strength, designed to punch through the ocean, the American program was becoming a laboratory of silence. In a restricted hangar, illuminated by the sparks of welders and the hum of ventilation, American engineers were putting the finishing touches on a machine that would redefine naval warfare. They called it the 688 class, the Los Angeles class. To the untrained eye, it looked like any other submarine, a black steel cylinder. But inside the hull, the philosophy of construction was alien to the Soviet mind. The Americans had realized decades earlier that in the nuclear age, speed was secondary to stealth. If you are fast but loud, you are just a noisy target. If you are slow but silent, you are a hole in the water. The secret to the ghost that terrified Captain Jуравлев lay in a concept known as rafting. In a Soviet submarine of this era, the massive turbines, the reduction gears, and the pumps were bolted directly to the hull frames. When a Soviet turbine spun, the vibration traveled through the bolt, into the hull steel, and radiated out into the ocean like a bell ringing. This is why Jуравлев's boat hummed. It was a ringing bell. The engineers of the 688 class did something radical. They built the entire engine room, hundreds of tons of machinery, on a floating platform inside the submarine. This platform, or raft, sat on complex rubberized sound isolation mounts. The machinery never touched the hull. The vibration was absorbed by the rubber. The hull remained dead. The Los Angeles class was not just a ship. It was a thermos bottle of sound. A sailor could drop a wrench in the engine room, and a sonar operator on a ship 10 miles away would hear nothing. But silence was only half of the equation. To be a true ghost, you need to see without being seen. And this is where the American technological dominance truly left the Soviets in the Dark Ages. The Soviet investigation in Part 2 failed because they assumed the Americans were limited by the same physics, specifically the problem of the baffles, the blind spot behind the sub. They assumed that to track Jуравлев, the American sub had to be on the side or in front. They were wrong. The Americans had deployed the AN/BQQ-5 sonar suite and, crucially, the towed array. Imagine a thick, black cable, over half a mile long, spooling out from the tail of the American submarine. This cable is studded with hydrophones, underwater microphones. By trailing this cable far behind the submarine, the sensors are removed from the noise of the sub's own propeller. They are out in the clean, quiet water. This was the magic that allowed the Americans to see through the blind spot. The Los Angeles class didn't need to move to the side to listen. It could sit directly behind a Soviet sub, trailing its long ear miles back, listening to the Soviet captain breathe while the Soviet sonar looked backward and saw nothing but the empty wake. Let us shift our perspective to the hunter. Meet Commander James "Red" Harrison, a composite of the era's aggressive skippers. He is the commanding officer of the USS Batfish, a Sturgeon-class attack submarine, the predecessor to the 688, but upgraded with the new ears. The scene in Harrison's attack center is the polar opposite of Jуравлев's. It is not dim and sweaty. It is cool, lit by the blue glow of digital fire control screens. There is no shouting. The discipline is absolute. Con, sonar, the voice comes over the headset. Contact Sierra 1 is steady. Range, 4,000 yards. Classification, Yankee-class nuclear ballistic missile submarine. Harrison sits in his chair, sipping coffee. He is not looking at a periscope. He is looking at a waterfall display, a cascading digital readout of sound frequency. To him, the Soviet sub is not a mystery. It is a loud, clanking factory. He can see the frequency line of their 50 Hz power plant. He can hear the specific rattle of a loose bearing on their starboard shaft. He knows the Soviet sub better than its own captain does. Very well, Harrison says softly. Maintain trail position. Stay in his baffles. Match speed. 6 knots. This is the impossible event from Part 1, seen from the other side. The Ghost was simply a highly trained American crew, utilizing superior physics to sit in the one spot the Soviets thought was safe. When Jуравлев ordered his check turn, swinging his boat to the right to clear his blind spot, he thought he was being clever. On the American sub, the sonar computer instantly registered the change in the Soviets' propeller pitch. Sierra 1 is shifting rudder, the sonar chief reports casually. He's clearing his baffles. Crazy Ivan to starboard. Gentle rudder left, Harrison orders. Drift out, let him pass. The American sub, silent on its rubber mounts, simply glides to the side. The Soviet active sonar blast, the ping that terrified Jуравлев, hits nothing but empty water, because the American sub has already anticipated the move. They are dancing a waltz, but only one partner knows the steps. The American sub slides back into position behind the Soviet vessel as soon as it straightens out. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse was blindfolded, and the cat was wearing night vision goggles. But the American advantage went deeper than just hardware. It was computational. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was lagging severely in microcomputing. Their sonar processing was largely analog. It required human operators to stare at raw oscilloscope waves to interpret sound. The Americans were digitizing the ocean. The computers aboard the Los Angeles class could take millions of bits of acoustic data and filter it. They could subtract the sound of rain, the sound of shrimp, the sound of waves, leaving only the artificial frequency of the enemy machine. This allowed the Americans to do something terrifying: target motion analysis without ever emitting a ping. They could calculate the exact range, speed, and depth of the Soviet sub using only math and passive listening. They could generate a firing solution for a Mark 48 torpedo that would guide the weapon to the target before the Soviet captain even knew he was under attack. The transient noises Jуравлев heard, the click of a hatch, that was likely the sound of the American crew going about their daily lives, perhaps a drop tray in the galley or a toilet flush valve, noises that were usually silenced but occasionally slipped out. The fact that Jуравлев heard a toilet flush but not the 6,000-ton submarine carrying it is a testament to how quiet the hull itself was. The American mission during this period was known as Hold Down. The objective was to prove that the Atlantic Ocean was a NATO lake. Every time a Soviet missile sub left the Kola Peninsula, an American attack sub would be waiting at the choke point, the GIUK Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. They would pick up the trail and never let go. For days, sometimes weeks, the American sub would shadow the Soviet boat. They would record their noise signatures. They would map their patrol patterns. They would practice simulated shots. To the American crews, this was a point of immense professional pride. They were the cowboys of the deep. They wore sneakers to reduce noise. They grew beards. They worked 18-hour days. And they knew they were invincible. But there was a danger in this dominance. The Americans became so good, so confident in their invisibility, that they began to take risks. They got closer and closer. They wanted to see how much they could get away with. The hole in the ocean that the Soviets detected in Part 1, that wasn't a glitch. That was the physical displacement of the American submarine getting so close to the Soviet hull, sometimes within a few hundred yards, that it actually blocked the background noise of the sea. They were drafting, like a race car, in the wake of the enemy. This secret war continued in the dark, a total triumph of American engineering and daring. The Soviets were spending billions on the wrong things, chasing phantoms, while the Americans were essentially reading their mail over their shoulders. However, secrets in the Cold War have a shelf life. The Americans thought this technological gap would last forever. They thought the Soviets were simply too far behind to catch up. They believed their acoustic daylight would never dim. But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And the weakest link in this story wasn't a piece of technology. It wasn't a sonar equation. It was a human being. The Soviets were about to get the answer they had been desperately searching for, not from a scientist and not from a spy satellite. They were about to get it from a traitor who walked right through the front door of the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and handed them the keys to the kingdom. The shock is coming, the moment the Soviets realized just how naked they really were. The mystery of the shadow was not solved in the North Atlantic. It was solved in a nondescript room in Moscow, under the harsh glare of a fluorescent light amidst a pile of stolen documents. The year is 1981. The breakthrough did not come from a Soviet scientist inventing a new sensor. It came from an American traitor named John Anthony Walker. Walker was a chief warrant officer in the United States Navy. For over a decade, he had been walking into Soviet embassies and handing over key lists, technical manuals, and tactical diagrams in exchange for cash. He is often cited as the most damaging spy in American naval history. But among the codes and the cipher keys, he handed the KGB something far more devastating: the blueprints of the American acoustic advantage. The shock moment occurred when a team of senior Soviet naval architects and KGB analysts finally sat down to correlate Walker's stolen data with the reports from captains like Zhuravlev. For years, the Soviet Admiralty had convinced themselves that the Americans were using some exotic, undetected physical principle to track them, perhaps radiation detectors or wake sensors. Walker's documents shattered this delusion. The documents revealed that there was no magic. There was no super sensor. The Americans were simply listening to the propellers. Specifically, Walker revealed that the Americans could detect cavitation at ranges the Soviets thought were impossible. Cavitation occurs when a propeller spins so fast that it creates low-pressure bubbles in the water. When these bubbles collapse, they snap shut with a loud acoustic crack. The Soviet engineers stared at the stolen charts in horror. The data showed that American attack submarines could classify a Soviet sub's individual propeller blade rate from 50 miles away. They could tell if a shaft was slightly misaligned. They could even identify individual vessels based on the specific rhythm of their engine room pumps. Admiral Gorshkov, the father of the Soviet Navy, reportedly read the assessment and turned pale. The realization was absolute and terrifying. The entire Soviet submarine fleet, hundreds of vessels, billions of rubles, the pride of the superpower, was not a stealth force. It was a fleet of drums banging in a library. Captain Zhuravlev's experience was finally explained. The transient sounds he heard? That was the American sub Batfish maneuvering close to him. The reason the ghost disappeared when he turned? The Americans knew his blind spots better than he did. The reason they couldn't find a tracking device on his hull? There was no device. The submarine itself was the beacon. This was the Pearl Harbor of the Soviet Navy, but it happened without a single shot being fired. They realized that in the event of a real war, their entire ballistic missile fleet, the insurance policy of the Soviet Union, would have been wiped out in the first 48 hours. The Americans would have been waiting in the baffles, ready to fire a torpedo the moment the order came. The balance of terror was a myth. The Americans held the gun to the Soviet head, and the Soviets hadn't even known it was loaded. Now came the panic. The response was frantic and desperate. The Soviet military-industrial complex, now aware of the fatal flaw, launched an emergency program to quiet their fleet. But they hit a technological wall. Their heavy industry was excellent at casting steel, but it lacked the precision required to make silent propellers. To make a silent propeller, you need to machine the bronze blades to a tolerance of less than a fraction of a millimeter. The curve must be perfect to slice the water without creating bubbles. Soviet milling machines were simply not accurate enough. They were stuck in the industrial age, while the Americans were in the digital age. This led to one of the most audacious and desperate operations of the Cold War, the Toshiba-Kongsberg scandal. In 1982, knowing they could not build the machines themselves, Soviet agents approached the Japanese company Toshiba and the Norwegian company Kongsberg. Through a complex web of lies and falsified export documents, they illegally purchased 9-axis computer-controlled milling machines, technology that was strictly embargoed by COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. These massive machines were smuggled into the Soviet Union. They were set up in the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad. For the first time, Soviet engineers could carve propellers with the same computer-aided precision as the Americans. The impact was immediate. The new propellers were fitted to the next generation of submarines, the Akula class, Shark, and the upgraded Victor III class. When these new boats put to sea in the mid-1980s, the American advantage suddenly shrank. The acoustic daylight began to dim. American sonar operators, used to hearing Soviet subs from counties away, suddenly found themselves having to work harder. The loud banging was replaced by a faint hum. But this was a futile response. It was a band-aid on a hemorrhage. The shock had come too late. By the time the Soviets began quieting their propellers in the mid-80s, the American economy and technology had already leapt forward again. While the Soviets were celebrating their new, quieter propellers, the Americans were deploying the next nightmare, active denial. They were integrating satellite oceanography, magnetic anomaly detection, and advanced computer processing that could pick up the absence of background noise. Furthermore, the strategic damage was already done. The Soviet leadership had lost faith in their own deterrent. The psychological impact of the Walker revelation crippled their confidence. They shifted their strategy from open ocean patrol to the bastion concept. Instead of prowling the Atlantic and threatening the US coast, Soviet missile subs were ordered to retreat. They pulled back into the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, hiding under the Arctic ice cap, protected by a ring of surface ships and aircraft. This was a retreat. It was an admission of defeat. The blue water navy that Gorshkov had dreamed of, a navy that could challenge the Americans anywhere on the globe, was dead. They were forced to hide in their own backyard because they knew that out in the deep water, the shadow was waiting for them. The futile nature of their response was best summarized by a defecting Soviet officer years later. He noted that while the Toshiba machines made the propellers quieter, they couldn't fix the pumps, the gears, or the reactor flow noise without rebuilding the entire submarine from scratch. You can put silent tires on a noisy truck, but the engine will still rattle. The Soviets spent the last decade of the Cold War frantically trying to patch a hole in their defenses that was systemic. They built bigger subs, like the massive Typhoon, hoping that size and armor would save them. They built faster subs, but they could never replicate the culture of silence and the precision engineering that the Americans had perfected over 30 years. The impossible event that Captain Jуравлев witnessed in 1978 was the precursor to the collapse of the Soviet system itself. It was a confrontation between a society built on quotas and heavy metal and a society built on microchips and precision. The mystery was solved. The The ghost was real, and it was made in America. But the true legacy of this encounter would only be fully understood when the Soviet Union finally fell, and the archives were opened to reveal just how one-sided the underwater war had really been. The Cold War did not end with a nuclear mushroom cloud rising over New York or Moscow. It ended in the accountant's ledger, and nowhere was the deficit more terrifyingly obvious than in the silent war beneath the waves. The verdict of this decades-long game of cat and mouse can be summarized in one devastating statistic, a number that remained classified top secret until long after the Berlin Wall fell. In the mid-1980s, following the revelations of the Walker spy ring and the analysis of Soviet exercises, American naval strategists ran a computer simulation of World War III. The parameters were simple. The Soviet Union launches a first strike. What happens to their submarines in the Atlantic? The result was a kill ratio that stunned even the most hawkish generals in the Pentagon. The simulation predicted that within the first 4 hours of hostilities, before they could even complete their firing sequences, over 90% of Soviet Yankee and Delta-class submarines in the Atlantic would be destroyed. 90%. This is the killer statistic. It renders the trillions of rubles spent by the Soviet Union on their naval expansion effectively wasted. They had built the largest submarine fleet in human history. They had launched hundreds of hulls. They had trained thousands of officers, like Captain Zhuravlev. They had created a force that looked terrifying on paper and in May Day parades. But in reality, they had built a fleet of floating coffins. The ghost that Zhuravlev encountered, the American attack submarine sitting in his baffles, was not an isolated incident. It was the standard operating procedure. For nearly 2 decades, the United States Navy had achieved a level of dominance that is rare in the history of warfare. It was akin to an army marching into battle with invisible tanks. The impact of this realization on the Soviet Union cannot be overstated. It broke the back of their strategic confidence. When the Soviet leadership realized that their blue water navy could not survive in the open ocean, they were forced into the bastion strategy we discussed in Part 4. But the economic consequences of this retreat were fatal. Because they had to hide their submarines in the Barents Sea, thousands of miles further away from the American coast than the Bermuda Box, their old missiles could no longer reach targets in the United States. To hit Washington, D.C. from the Arctic, they needed bigger, heavier, longer-range missiles. To carry these massive new missiles, they had to build massive new submarines. This birthed the Typhoon class, the Project 941 Akula. It remains the largest submarine ever built. It was a titan of steel, twice the size of its American counterparts, featuring swimming pools and saunas for the crew. It was a marvel of Soviet heavy industry, but it was also a catastrophic economic black hole. One Typhoon-class submarine cost as much to build as an entire city, and the Soviets built 6 of them. They were pouring concrete into the ocean, while the United States was investing in the microchip, the internet, and the software revolution, technologies that had both military and civilian applications. The Soviet Union was bankrupting itself trying to mill silent propellers and weld titanium hulls just to survive. This connects the mystery of the Phantom Sub to the macro theme of the Soviet collapse, the triumph of software over hardware. The American advantage wasn't that they had better steel, it was that they had better information. The Los Angeles class was a computer with a propeller. The Soviet subs were tanks with periscopes. In the modern age, the computer always wins. The Toshiba Kongsberg scandal was the final admission that the Soviet system had failed. A superpower that can put a man in space but cannot manufacture a silent propeller blade without buying illegal machines from its enemies is not a superpower. It is a hollow giant. The legacy of this underwater conflict shapes our world today. The technology developed to track Zhuravlev, the digital signal processing, the advanced hydrodynamics, the satellite oceanography, didn't just win the war, it laid the groundwork for the modern surveillance state. The ocean, once the last great wilderness where a captain could vanish, became a glass house. And what of the men? Captain Valery Zhuravlev and his generation of commanders were left to watch their empire rust. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the mighty fleet that had terrorized the Atlantic was abandoned. In the icy ports of the Kola Peninsula, specifically in Olenja Bay, dozens of nuclear submarines were tied up and left to rot. The Yankee-class boats, the very vessels Žuravlev commanded, were stripped of their missiles. Their reactor cores were removed, often funded by American money under the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, and their hulls were cut up for scrap. It is a haunting image. The terrifying machines that once held the world hostage, reduced to piles of jagged metal in the snow. The razor blades you used this morning might have once been the hull of a Soviet missile boat that prowled the Bermuda Box. But the true legacy is the silence. If you go to the North Atlantic today, the game continues, but the players have changed. The Russian Federation has rebuilt. Their new Yasen-class submarines are incredibly quiet, utilizing the lessons learned from their humiliations in the 70s and 80s. The gap has closed. The Ghost is no longer the undisputed master of the deep. The ocean is dark again. However, the lesson of 1978 remains relevant. It teaches us that hubris is the most dangerous enemy. The Soviets believed they were strong because they were big. They believed they were safe because they couldn't hear the danger. They ignored the anomalies. They rationalized the ghosts. Captain Žuravlev's horror wasn't just about an enemy submarine. It was the horror of a man realizing that his entire worldview was false. He realized that while he was playing checkers, his enemy was playing three-dimensional chess. In the end, the Cold War wasn't won by the missile that was fired. It was won by the missile that didn't need to be fired, because the enemy knew, with absolute certainty, that he was already dead before he could reach for the button. This is Cold War Chronicles. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the invisible war, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We have only just scratched the surface of the secrets buried beneath the ice. Until next time, stay silent, stay deep.